Used to make international headlines, but no longer does. The repression of journalism in Egypt continues virtually unabated, but the coverage of the crackdown has waned. Last week, a court in Cairo sentenced 3 members of the Egyptian press syndicate to 2-year jail terms for having harbored journalists who were on the run from the police. Against a backdrop of numerous jailings of media workers, activists, and human rights advocates, this case is different. Never before has the press syndicate been taken to court by the state. There was another big legal ruling this past week commuting the death sentence of former president and Muslim Brotherhood Party leader Mohamed Morsi. Given how loudly so many mainstream news outlets supported the outlawing of the Muslim Brotherhood, this ruling served as a loyalty test for the Egyptian news media. There are still huge numbers of people behind bars in Egypt, many of them journalists, but their cases have mostly gone unreported, and many of their names are unknown. Our starting point this week is Cairo. The Egyptian press syndicate is more than an organization. In the minds of many citizens, it is a place, a safe one. The building is a short walk from Tahrir Square and is in some ways just as symbolic. A place that the security forces would never breach and had never breached until April of this year, when 2 journalists wanted by the police took shelter there.
The press syndicate has functioned as a kind of safe space for some degree of activism, and a lot of protests have taken place at or right outside on the stairs of the syndicate historically. And the fact that the syndicate's walls were not previously raided by the security apparatus gave protesters a modicum of safety in using the syndicate as a place to gather. Now that that's been violated, this marks a significant escalation in the repression of the press in Egypt.
The press syndicate has a very long history in Egypt. It was during the Nasser years, like with other professions, a syndicate that was really state-controlled. And the turning point was in 1995 when the Mubarak regime tried to pass a repressive media law, and the syndicate played a huge role in opposing this and got the government to make a U-turn. The Sisi regime has tried to rein back this progress and has tried to bring the syndicate and wider media under its wing, so to speak.
This latest chapter in the syndicate story goes back 6 months, and the pair of reporters the organization sheltered from the security services. The 2 work for a news site called Yanayir and had been charged with spreading false news for their reporting on the El-Sisi government's decision to transfer 2 islands in the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia. The transfer of the islands, which came after the Saudis agreed to pump billions of dollars into Egypt's struggling economy, sparked the kinds of demonstrations rarely seen by the Sisi government. 3 senior officials at the syndicate have been jailed for harboring the 2 Yanayir journalists, who have been cleared of the false news charges, the specifics of which were never revealed.
What does it mean to disseminate false news when the government itself is in the business of disseminating false news? It typically means providing, publishing, disseminating any information that goes against the government agenda.
There's a lot of complications in determining who's really got sovereignty over the islands, and certainly people have a right to publish critical views on that. The fact that the syndicate simply allowed those individuals to stay safely within its walls shouldn't be seen as a criminal offense. The state should focus on making its case to the people rather than repressing individuals who want to criticize the decisions being taken.
Mr. Sisi himself defined this action as a criminal action, as the government going after an illegal criminal offense and not as one of freedom of speech. By saying, we're not going after journalists. Journalists are free to express themselves. We are rather going after a criminal offense, which is harboring suspects or fugitives, and the place where they were harbored happened to be the press syndicate.
72 hours after the 3 syndicate officials were sentenced, an appeals court issued another judgment, overturning the death sentence, awaiting the former president Mohamed Morsi, and ordering a retrial. When Morsi, Egypt's first democratically elected president, was overthrown in 2013, the syndicate chose to remain silent. And the following year, when 3 Al Jazeera journalists were sentenced to jail terms for allegedly aiding Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood, a verdict the U.S. government called chilling and draconian, and the UN described as crushing the media, the syndicate chose its words carefully, saying it did not want to comment on verdicts from the judiciary. Dozens of Egyptian journalists are still behind bars. No one seems to know exactly how many. Among them are writer-researcher Ismail Alexandrani and Mahmoud Abu Zaid, a photographer who calls himself Shakan. 6 months ago, at a court appearance, Shakan and his fellow inmates called out the syndicate for its selective protection of Egyptian journalists. The sign says, "Hey, press syndicate, why is there no support for the 10 of us?"
Mahmoud Abu Zaid's case is very interesting, and it's very tragic in many ways. He's been held without trial for more than 3 years now. We're talking about somebody who was simply taking photographs at the Rabaa Square site in Cairo. That was the site of the largest of the state-sponsored massacres that took place after the military coup. So you can understand from the government's perspective why he was a wanted man. They consider whatever was on his camera to be very important evidence against them.
In the case of Mr. Alexandrani, there are two issues that bothers the Egyptian government about him. One of them is that he tends to write about Sinai. Sinai is an extremely sensitive area in Egypt right now. There's an Islamist insurgency sympathetic to Islamic State going on. Soldiers and policemen are getting killed and bombed. But also, I think what really bothers the government is that Mr. Alexandrani is a well-known speaker and writer in North America, in Egypt, but also in Western Europe, where he speaks critically about government policies in Sinai and elsewhere.
يجمعوا بين تكتيك قوات حرب العصابات وتكتيكات القوات الخاصة، لأن قائد عملياتهم هو المقدم الصاعقة المفصول من الخدمة هشام عشمي.
I think those were the real reasons why he's in jail.
We've seen other journalists who've had dual, Canadian citizenship or Australian citizenship benefit from that sort of rally, that sort of outcry. But the Egyptian government can more or less do what it wills with Egyptian citizens who don't possess dual citizenship.
A lot of these cases have dragged on for years, and one of the justifications for not actually pursuing the trial is that they can't get a courtroom big enough for the number of defendants being charged, which seems like a kind of ridiculous reason not to proceed. So unfortunately, there's a bit of a Kafkaesque environment when it comes to these trials and how they're pursued, and the inability of the state to follow through with due process in a timely fashion.
Timothy Kaldas talked to us from Cairo via Skype. We contacted many journalists in Egypt for interviews. They chose not to speak. They saw what happened to Ismail Alexandrani after he wrote what he did, what happened to Shakan after he took those pictures, and what happened to dozens more of their colleagues. And now, having seen the leaders of the syndicate jailed after they tried to shelter journalists, they know that in Sisi's Egypt, there are very few safe places left to write, to speak, and almost nowhere left to hide. On the download now, our viewers on the state of journalism in Egypt.
A lot of dissidents and journalists have been jailed without any trial, and the way in which the government can get away with it is by saying that they have electoral mandate for it. But as we know, in any democratic system, you also need minority rights and right to dissent without fear, and that does not exist in Egypt.
The Egyptian regime has been extremely successful in its use of violence and repression against its opponents. Its success is basically lying on two different dimensions. It was able to sell itself as a bulwark against extremism. It was able to use its massive media empire to revive extreme chauvinistic nationalism, which justified repression and placed all opposition activities in light of sabotage, espionage, or conspiring with foreign powers.
Other media stories that are on our